So we are joined by Kevin Law, VP of Global Customer Marketing at Freshworks. Kevin works at the intersection of community, customer marketing, and growth, helping organizations turn community into a strategic advantage. So, in this keynote, Stop Building Community, Start Orchestrating Influence. He will challenge how we think about community and explore how it can become a true growth driver. Kevin, we are so excited to have you here. It's over to you.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me okay? I think so. Well, thank you, Paula, for the time to present. And let me go ahead and switch my screen so I can look at my slides. First off, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity. And I'm going to be talking about probably maybe a little bit of a different topic than some of the other sessions, perhaps. I sit at an interesting space with working at Freshworks for the past 2 years, building a global customer marketing practice, which is kind of really powered across 7 different pillars, community being one of them. And so I've been both a community practitioner, and I've seen, both what it's like to work on community programs, as well as like how do you translate that narrative to the C-suite. And I think sometimes that is a little bit of an art and science, depending on who your CEO, your leadership team is, and all those things that you have to deal with just to get buy-in and connections with others. So why don't we go ahead and dive into the information. In particular, I want to talk a little bit more about the state of the post-sale. Many of you guys are in tech companies, you work in different organizations, and I would probably argue that the post-sale experience is generally fairly messy. Part of that is that it tends to be a little bit siloed based on which parts of the organization you sit under, whether it's customer success, which might own some of the outcomes related to the customer, support, which is related to the resolution, community, which is really about sort of that engagement and building sort of that peer network. And then you have sort of like customer marketing advocacy, which is owning sort of like that proof and advocate ecosystem. And then education, which is around sort of adoption. And the frank reality is that because I think when we're starting to evolve our practice, especially in the age of AI, a lot of these organizations are now looking to see how to drive better efficiency, how to drive more scale. And because some of the reporting lines have been very differentiated in the past, it's led to very disjointed outcomes for the customer. And customers often don't really care about your org chart. They really just want to understand how do you get value faster. And so some of this discussion that we're going to have today is how does community help drive that motion, but how do we also think more collaboratively around all the other functions within the post-sale experience to drive delight, satisfaction, and really sort of that evangelism for your brand. And so all this is also kind of happening in the same point when B2B discovery is also changing permanently. No surprise, I don't have to tell you this, that AI search vendor relationships with the sales and in terms of how like customers buy things, it's changed pretty much over the past several months, just even in 2026. A lot of the discussions even that we have within our own marketing organization is really around how do we influence AEO search? How do we influence a lot of LLMs? A lot of this now is being directly impacted through things like peer review sites, community content. I think this is where community plays a huge part in terms of both the visibility of companies and brands, their perceptions, and the rich data that they have access to. And a lot of the other kind of like third-party mentions, PR releases, and not necessarily just sort of like the traditional kind of demand marketing campaigns that have existed previously. And this also kind of comes to play with sort of like diminishing returns on demand spend in general, and sort of like where is actually going to drive sort of search impressions and what's going to move the needle when it comes to growth and pipeline impact for your business. But I honestly think that the window of time to be able to do this is a very finite piece because all organizations are trying to figure this right now. Everyone's trying to experiment, they're trying to learn, they're trying to figure out what is sort of like the key ingredients that's going to make your company stand out, both from a brand standpoint, competitive landscape, driving customers back to your site or your prospects for that matter. And I do think the customer ecosystem of what we build around the post-sale experience in particular is sort of that competitive moat. And you can't really buy your way through that. You have to be able to build the trust, as you know, through your customers and through the community that you're developing and curating. and then figuring out how do you essentially like leverage that more cohesively across the ecosystem. And so the challenge that I had to face when I was a community practitioner is that it really shifted the way I had to think about community and the kind of the broader context of around the overall ecosystem and what's at stake for the business. And I had a boss at the time that actually asked me a question around what would we actually lose if we shut it all down? Meaning, if we stopped the community forums, if we stopped the community programs, the peer networking, and we really just didn't have to deal with it at all. And I was tackling the question around sort of things around like engagement, membership growth, how customers love our programs, the sense of the personal relationships that they get from that experience. But the problem was that my boss was very much a GM for the business and didn't really understand sort of the intrinsic value that it actually brought for the organization. They saw some of the stats, the numbers, but ultimately that was something that didn't quite land with them. And so I had to pivot. I had to figure out like, what is it we're going to do? Otherwise, we're essentially going to lose our budget, our resources. We're going to have headcount that's going to get decreased. We're not going to get the investment in our own platforms. And that was kind of the reality in that position at that time when I had that role. And I had to really think about this. And I went back to a time where I'll give you kind of an example. Many folks may remember sort of a platform called Influitive. Influitive, I was one of like the early adopters back in even like 2013. And this was a photo that was taken in 2017 where they had sort of like these Advocate of the Month posters that they would mail out to people. And, my boss at the time had put this on a wall in the office, which was kind of embarrassing, but also kind of funny. And for all intents and purposes, we had a really good experience with Influitive. We built a fan club. We built a sense of community around like gamification. We had customers that joined. We had 1,500 plus. They were part of our hub, is what they called it. We gave out swag, we had gift cards and all that kind of good stuff. But the problem was that it wasn't actually moving the needle when we actually needed it the most when it came to competitive deals. We were very much in a very hyper-focused, very competitive landscape. And the challenge was we need to be able to service up key references for enterprise deals. And a lot of our customers just weren't meeting the mark. And so essentially what I found and realized over that time and that period is that even though we were winning these awards, we were winning these accolades, we weren't really building an advocacy bench that was going to really help support the business in the ways that were needed most critically to help move the needle and drive impact and growth. So it really became sort of a volume, velocity, activity-based team and function. And I had to learn this the hard way because I was looking to see what was actually translating and essentially kind of looking at like grasping for straws at the time, even though we were winning all these kind of awards and the celebration. And I look at this as sort of a same inflection point of kind of how business leaders are questioning sort of the impact of some of these programs and growth. We have to be able to translate what is it that we do from a outcome perspective that's going to be focused on the business, especially if you work for organizations that are focused on revenue, which probably is the majority of the people on this call. And so it's a different kind of conversation that you have to have. Some of that comes through learned experience, but I also think of it as sort of like having a decoder ring of how do you translate CEO, CFO speak in the minds of the programs that you run so that they're very clear in terms of the impact it's driving. So some of this conversation is going to help hopefully kind of think about some of those things and then take it kind of the next level. And so what I had to do, especially when I took on this new role at Freshworks, I took a lot of the learnings and some of the past experience that I had, and I had to figure out like, how do I present this to my leadership team? I remember very intimately, like within the first 30 days, I had to present my plan to our CEO and to the C-suite at the time. And the question that really came up in my mind was like, how do you bridge that gap between what I was doing and the concept at the time our team was called customer engagement. People didn't really know what that meant. And so I had to be able to translate exactly what is that world and what is it that we're trying to build that at the end of the day is really going to drive impact for the organization and drive revenue at the end of the day. And so I really bottomed that down to sort of like the North Star goal. It's not really about community or advocacy or any of these functions, really. The end goal that we're really trying to strive for is really around customer obsession. How do we get our North Star to be the focus on everything that is the customer first experience and making sure that they have an exceptional experience with that process, whether they're talking to a sales rep, a support agent, the product experience, everything we do bottoms line to sort of driving this obsession nature that's really going to get your customers to stay with you. It's going to drive that stickiness. It's going to help impact the post-sale experience and do all the things that we say is going to really move the impact and create sort of this broader sense of the value of what our products are actually able to deliver. And so when I talked about customer obsession, I actually use this stat. I use this in almost every single presentation because it helps to drive home the impact that customer obsession really does drive business revenue at the end of the day if you actually let it. Customer obsessed organizations that grow at a faster pace, they have higher profit margins, they actually have better customer attention, no surprise. I know most of the people probably get that. But then the other aspect is sort of better employee engagement as well. So the inherent translation is that as your employees understand the customer, the products that we're delivering, it creates that goodwill, it creates sort of that sense of pride and ownership. It helps them ship things faster. It gets them to think more in terms of customer outcomes as opposed to just the product or the feature that they're building. And so across the board, this was sort of like the data points it helped share with leadership to really get them to understand the foundation of what we're trying to build before we could even have the conversation around this is what we're doing in community, this is what we're doing in customer education, etc. The other thing is that when we go into some of these conversations, and I think this is also tough because if you don't have the right leadership support or executive support, we're going to the conversation perhaps with the wrong scorecard. You may be covering things that you have control over because you're simply, it's the data that you have access to at the moment. And it could be things around like membership, which is, for us, it's about 50,000, members in our community, which is, it's a great number to have, but it's a data point. And then you also have post and engagement rate, which kind of shows like there's some activity. You have attendance, whether it's your events, your in-person conferences, etc. You have community NPS, which is also kind of a data point, but we have to be able to translate what is the outcome that this is driving. We also get like period answer responses from our tickets. But then again, in sort of the age of AI, this is really kind of disrupting what it means to actually be able to drive sort of that at scale. And so the gap is really around how do you translate sort of that language again to what your C-suite actually cares about. And so this goes back to the kind of premise of what I wanted to cover in this presentation, which is really around community is not a program you build. It's really sort of like an influence you help orchestrate. And the way that I think about this holistically and what we've actually seen success with is basically not building it across 7 different distinct pillars, which I like to call customer-led growth, which is also kind of an industry term around how do you support the customer in helping to drive that customer obsession across their journey, across their experience. And so I'll talk about that a little more in terms of how we were able to translate that, some of the impact we drove within Freshworks and things that we're kind of building at the same time. And the reason why I kind of like the concept around a flywheel is kind of the same thing as sort of like a system. Really, the term system is, the acronym for me is like save yourself some time, energy, and money, because a system is repeatable. It's something like, if you have chaos and you want to build and bring order to it, you create a system or an architecture, you build something that teams can plug into. It's scalable. And so program thinking is really around you have a finite program or a set of deliverables that you're responsible for, whether it's a launch or some type of initiative like a webinar. But if you can create sort of if you think about the output of a webinar, it's really to drive awareness. It's to get them to take the next recommended action. You could also do this if you build a proof engine that services the right type of story candidates, the right type of examples that help your sellers, really be able to be competitive when they're dealing with other, when they're dealing with like a prospect or a one-to-one conversation, or doing it from a one-to-many perspective. Reference requests, again, how do you can deploy it at the right deal stage? Community posts really to drive sort of the right signal for AI visibility. Moving away from just kind of a QBR template or a presentation and thinking about how is it going to drive upsell conversations over the next coming weeks and earlier. And then I talked a little bit about sort of case studies, but the whole net point of this is that programs are sort of like tasks. They have a end date, essentially. Systems are really sort of like the engines, and the engines are certain things that help you sort of like compound and drive that scale. And so that's why building this kind of seven piece pillar has really been able to help us drive sort of that renewed energy and focus on the customer. So what are sort of like those 7 pillars? For us, customer obsession, as I mentioned, sort of community kind of sits at the forefront of this. It's sort of the area that we look at to build both the engagement, the networking, the connection, the sense of purpose, as well as sort of building that foundational layer. Every company I've ever worked at, community has always been sort of that foundational piece that brings it together to really get your customers to be energized. And usually it should be the first place a customer gets access to when they're getting involved in your ecosystem. But then the other pieces that I also consider very deeply is sort of like lifecycle and adoption marketing. How do you make sure you're focused on the right aspects of the journey within that first 30, 60, 90 days, and then even beyond that, really to help your CSMs, your account teams, to move the needle between both a sales to a post-sale experience, and then get your customer to see value immediately. Voice the customer is really how you're starting to harness sort of the feedback, the insights that you're capturing across your customer base, whether it's through an NPS, a CSAT survey, or even just transactionally, just understanding what is it that they have a friction or a challenge with, and how do you close the loop with that feedback. Advocacy, which again is really around how do you create more raving fans of your products and services. Customer education is how do you develop more upskill and training and learning and education that's focused on helping them do it in their own time, so they don't have to be directly talking to a CSM or an account team or a support agent to get their support that they need. And then customer comms is like, how do you deliver one-to-many kind of consistent language and feedback and communications at the end of the day that's going to drive sort of the connection in terms of what your brand voice is, what you're trying to communicate from product launches, etc., and do it in a way that is consistent across the board. The last one I kind of want to highlight in particular is executive engagement, because this oftentimes I think is also where it becomes sort of a false multiplier, where in most organizations, if you have to sell up to a C-suite buyer, whether it's a CIO, a CMO, a CRO, whatever that may be, oftentimes executive engagement, whether it's a customer advisory board, executive briefing centers, things of that nature, these could be all things that help really reduce sales cycles. I look at this as like all these things combined create sort of this 2 + 2 = 16 type of equation. That's kind of a phrase my boss likes to use a lot, because you're not really doing addition anymore. You're looking at multiplication, and you're really being able to drive sort of like that false multiplier effect around what it means to actually drive sort of this renewed focus on the post-sale and the customer at the end of the day, because it actually helps with reducing churn. It drives better expansion, brand trust, aided visibility, etc., kind of everything I ever talked about earlier. And so to give you kind of an example, this is my team chart in terms of what we built over the past almost 2.5 years now at Freshworks. And we were very clear at the very beginning, like our mission statement is develop this sort of flywheel to drive customer passion, create exceptional experiences, drive product adoption, retention, and really create customers for life. And I like that phrase, customers for life, because as you deliver such a great experience for your customer, it means that they're going to go with you in every organization that they move to in the future. And in most cases, I think a lot of folks, they usually move jobs every 18 to 24 months. This is an opportunity where if you deliver that experience, wherever they go to their next organization, they're going to bring your solution or your product with them. And I've seen that countless times when I was at Marketo through that Adobe acquisition. I've seen that in my company at F5. I've seen that at Freshworks. And so it becomes sort of this model that has been the way that I've thought about sort of community in the broader sense of customer marketing and customer-led growth. But essentially, when I started this function, our team was focused very much transactionally and sort of advocacy. It was around how do we create more raving fans? How do we get more customer stories, evidence? You as community practitioners may even be asked to do some of these things because if either you sit within a customer marketing team or because people inherently know that usually a lot of your best fans and advocates tend to come from your community. So this was kind of like a foundational piece, but we were missing some of the other ingredients. We started to build up a more formal community program or practice, which was focused on adoption retention. And we had, so of course, our online forums, we had ambassador programs, we had top contributors. We also had fun, which is essentially our user groups. But that became sort of like two very strategic and very important areas around our pillar. And then I mentioned sort of education being sort of the focus around really upskilling and learning became kind of the fundamental aspect about it. We had an academy, which we now call Freshworks University. And it has a bunch of different courses and trainings. Even our employee base, about 50% of them actually take our online courses and trainings that are designed for customers. So they actually can learn our products faster, especially if they're a brand new employee that's trying to get acclimated to the system very quickly. I talked a little bit about sort of lifecycle retention marketing, with really being sort of focusing on sort of that pre-90s, what we call it, sort of onboarding to later in the journey, which we call Jumpstart, which is focused on maybe that 6 to 12 months and then beyond that. But that's a multi-channel approach around sort of email, webinars, in-product journeys, workshops of that nature to kind of drive sort of that coordinated motion. And then I talked about a little bit the exec and the VOC piece and the customer comms piece. So this is essentially, when we think about it holistically, this is my team's charter that's focused on not just like one aspect. I actually really do think of the name customer marketing is probably a misnomer, but really the focus around the customer experience and at the end of the day and how it's going to drive delight, satisfaction, renewed focus, community, and all those kind of things we care about. And we don't do this in a silo. I think the aspect around being able to build this in cross-functional collaboration with so many teams is the reason why we've been successful, is because we don't necessarily take credit for things that are, shared goals or outcomes. We wouldn't be able to do this without these teams at the same time. So it's super critical to be able to kind of showcase and build that trust with your leadership as well as with your peers. And so some of the things that in terms of the motion, I want to kind of share in terms of some of the numbers. Again, community numbers in terms of membership is great, best answers, but there's also like pipeline influence. There's promoters that are also identified. There's the aspect around like how is it driving other types of campaigns and programs around reviews. And then even just like what we call like shipped ideas. So we have like an idea section in community. It's been sort of like a laundry list of different things, but that's actually driven a lot of great ideas for our product teams to really understand kind of like what's the landscape of things that they should prioritize for the roadmap and in the future. And so this is just kind of a snapshot of some of the things happening over the past quarter that I wanted to highlight, so people get a kind of a sense in terms of things that we showcase. But then the other side of it is what the system is actually producing when we think about customer-led growth is sort of, we create this stickiness. I look at this as very much how do you create this competitive moat, and it creates sort of that when you start to add all these programs, initiatives together, it creates that flywheel effect. And so what I mean by switching costs, it means that if you create such a great experience for a practitioner and an end user that is part of your community ecosystem, whether they're earning the badges, they're getting sort of like that reputation as being like a thought leader in their space, they're getting that peer networking aspect, it makes it more difficult for them to want to switch to a new platform or a new ecosystem, right? Like, I mean, take Android and the Apple iOS. I mean, that's kind of like the same thing. Like I've been an Apple user for probably 20 years now, and I'm never going to go back to anything else. And so they have me kind of built into that broader ecosystem that I want to be a part of. I think the same thing can be applied when you think about your own tech stack and your own products that you're delivering, whether it is a product or a service. And I think that's also creating sort of this workflow where, again, you're creating sort of this ecosystem where a competitor can't necessarily just take it over overnight. I think that's also the differentiator when we think about the world of AI, where as much as like a bot or a Claude Code could build something very quickly, there is sort of that reputation that a customer has and the longevity that they've had with their account teams, with you as a community practitioner, through your programs that can't just necessarily switch overnight. And so that creates a competitive moat that I think also needs to be translated to how you communicate this to your stakeholders and your leaders, et cetera. And then this also becomes a great source for like, advocacy, peer momentum. We actually saw this a lot through our own review sites across Gartner Peer Insights and some of the other ones like Trust Race and G2. So the point being is really this creates sort of like that compound effect. And then the other thing is like, as you start to create these layers, I almost think of it as like layers of a cake. You're also starting to get a lot more nominations. You've probably been in situations where your team's been asked to actually surface customer examples or wins and all those kind of things. You can start doing it much more faster, I think, when you have a more integrated center of excellence around community advocacy, lifecycle, all come playing together in one team and function. This is how we really were able to start to drive sort of that motion and the flywheel, because naturally, as we had community active top contributors, they started to be involved in our advocacy programs. We involved them in what we call our insiders program, as well as champions, which essentially is something that they have to apply for. And then also, just as we found really interesting use cases that customers would post on community, this became a aspect around like helping us get more proof points, more data points that our sellers could use, our account teams could use at the end of the day. So kind of a cool thing around the proof velocity. And then we talked a little bit sort of like the AI visibility piece a little bit. I really want to drive home, especially if there's one thing that you take away with this, is that community being sort of a hotbed when it comes to AI visibility and like the gold mine of content that you have access to, which is really going to help support AEO. There's also that aspect around sort of like Reddit, which I'm sure many people in the community space are now thinking about a lot. We started to do a lot of pilots around AEO and Reddit in particular, because as I mentioned at the very beginning, as the focus on the customer is really going to drive sort of like that LLM visibility. And whether it's the community content you produce, the reviews that you're driving, or the whole ecosystem you're building, these are things that are going to have long-term effects as sort of like the models start to iterate faster every next 3 to 6 months, et cetera. And we don't necessarily know what's going to shift or change, but I think the aspect around like as LLMs want to drive deeper knowledge and learning and depth, a lot of the information that you have within your community and a lot of these forums like Reddit are going to be super valuable in the future. And so we're doing a lot of testing around that today. And then I covered a little bit more about sort of like the enterprise review coverage when it turns to how do you create this activation flywheel. So whether community and advocacy or customer marketing kind of sit in the same function or differently, this is also where you can start to drive sort of like that concerted motion around sort of like as customers are ripe for advocacy activation or they become hand raisers, you start to embed them into your ecosystem. And that's just one aspect. It's not the only one that you could drive this, but it's one of the things that helped kind of showcase that to leaders. And then I think the content indexing, which I kind of talked about, which is really getting buyers to surface a lot of the content that you've developed over time within your own communities or your Slack channels, et cetera. So this is where it's starting to drive this at scale from a systems perspective. The other thing I like to kind of translate is the executive, like I said, kind of like decoder ring. If you think about sort of like the 4 people that are probably most critical to your stakeholder relationship mapping. I deliberately took off the CMO piece because I think that's a little bit, community can sit in many different functions for sure. It tends to do, it does tend to sit in marketing a lot of times, but I think the marketing equation, there's a different way to kind of handle it around sort of like the other piece that I mentioned around like search is one thing that CMOs cared very deeply about. They care a lot about proof and evidence as you start to move up market in more enterprise organizations, if that's a focus for you. And so that is a little kind of a different translation than I think to these kind of 4 groups. And I'll start with the CFO, for example, because usually, this is the person that has control over the money. And the thing that they care about the most is usually, especially if you're a SaaS business, is really net dollar retention. Net dollar retention is sort of like the holy grail of SaaS success. If you have a positive net dollar retention, that means if you don't even acquire a new customer and your net dollar retention is 110, as an example, it means you're still going to grow at 10% year over year, simply by able to retaining your customer base and not getting them to churn. So the equation for how you translate that to the CFO is focusing on retention and expansion. I have some like very deliberate statements I'll show you in a second, but the net of it is happy customers buy more stuff. Community engagement drives retention measurably at higher rates. And these are some of the things that you can kind of showcase in terms of the data points that we've been able to showcase around our own community and around our own customer-led growth flywheel. Then you have like the CRO, which is usually responsible for all sales functions, maybe even support for that matter. It's how do you cut deal velocity in half or make it faster, essentially. And these are some examples of kind of things we've done for helping the sales team be able to be more successful, reduce that friction, driving opportunity value faster. I think from a CPO perspective, they care a lot about adoption and stickiness. So how do you ensure that your VOC or your voice of customer programs, whether it's voice of customer you're capturing from your community or from a formal VOC practice, which has intake questions from customers where you're doing in-depth interviews as well as surveys of some kind, how is it actually influencing your roadmap? How is it driving better resolution and making sure that it's helping actually like nudge customers in the right direction, and it's actually helping them to shape kind of their overall thinking of what the product portfolio should be. And then the last one, which I think is probably the most important, is the CEO, which cares a lot about durable growth and AI visibility. Again, it comes down to like CEO VOC insights going to make us drive both stronger growth opportunities, but also I think my CEO is really focused on like customer stories from iconic brands and how do you have more credible use cases around AI, so that as they speak to investors, the media, even through executive thought leadership, it becomes sort of like the AI advantage. And so this is how we've been able to kind of translate some of that over the past 2 years that I've been working here. And this is kind of another example, and you guys will have access to the slides, I think, afterwards. But essentially, some of the things you can kind of say is like a statement, as an example, is like to your CFO, customer engagement systems impacted, X dollars in pipeline closing this, engaged customers retain at a measurably higher rate. The gap is protecting revenue. I think the interesting thing specifically around sort of like the CFO piece is that we had a theory at the very beginning that we wanted to prove out a model where as customers engage in 1, 2, 3, whatever number of programs, they're going to churn at a lower rate. They're going to expand at a higher rate. And that was something we wanted to continue to deliberately build out and showcase over the time that I've been working at the company. And so that was kind of an aspect of how we kind of were able to translate it. And then really, I think as you kind of orchestrate the model, how do you operate the system in 4 moves? One is start to map your influence back to what are sort of the key outcomes and goals your company is focused on. Whether you can drive executive alignment with your CMO, your CPO, et cetera, find 1 or 2 stakeholders that this really can make the biggest difference for, and then connect every moment to some type of downstream income or outcome. I would imagine, especially if you're on a fiscal year 26, your leadership team, whether it's your CEO or your C-suite in general, have kind of communicated what are the strategic priorities for the business. The more that you can align what you're doing at a community level back to kind of those outcomes is really going to make your programs more sticky, and how you showcase and translate that in the way that you communicate your program updates, whether it's through email, through Slack, whatever the case might be, and showcasing at the right moment. And that is the most critical thing as you start to think about how that's going to impact and drive growth, especially if you're looking for new platforms, new investment, experimentation with AI, I think is some of the other aspect of that. But making sure that it helps you actually translate that language to your executive team before you actually get into budget season. And I can go on and on, but I want to kind of show you an example of something that might actually be helpful for you. I built a tool completely in Cloud Code, and this was something that I spent probably about a week or so just kind of like developing. And this is something I want to give you as like a giveaway. It's a CLG diagnostic tool. So it scores across 7 different pillars. I'll show you the model. There's also a revenue impact model associated with it. And you can also upload sort of like community intelligence on any company that that has publicly facing information. Again, the model itself probably could use some refinement, but given that I built this in like a week, I would say it's pretty good as a POC. And you can play around with it. The only thing I ask is that I'm going to be giving it to all my subscribers on a Substack that I've been running since last November called the Customer Continuum. I'll have a link in the last slide that you can kind of take a look at it. But I'll show you an actual demo of this site because I think it's actually really cool in terms of what Cloud Code was able to build. And I'm not a developer by trade, so learning this was very much a steep learning curve to begin with. But this is a maturity model. This is kind of like an app that I kind of built out. And this shows kind of like the 7 layers of the customer-led growth flywheel. And if someone wanted to click on, for example, voice the customer, it'll give them kind of a description of what the practice could be, what are some of the data points that are important. You can again pull on like comms as another example, and it will kind of showcase some of those different aspects as well. And then if you go to the diagnostic tool, I actually thought this was kind of cool because you can create sort of like a health score or a benchmark. And so if you, for example, were to say, you're really strong on voice of the customer, but you're sort of an emerging when it comes to community engagement, advocacy might be like a 1, comms might be a 5, education might be a 2. It'll give you kind of a maturity model and a score. Again, this is just used as sort of like directionally. It'll give you kind of like top priority areas of things that you can kind of invest in going forward. And the way that you can actually help drive the conversation with your leadership team is I also build a revenue impact model. So essentially it's kind of like a revenue impact calculator. So you could put in your company's revenue, whether it's 100 million, find out what your net dollar retention is. You could probably get this from your sales operations teams, marketing operations if you don't have it access to it yourself. And you could say, find out what your retention rate is. Maybe it's 90%. And let's say your churn rate is like 15, and your number of customers is like 5,000, but your deal size is 75,000 as an example. This will give you kind of like your projected impact of what you could drive. Obviously, as you play with like bigger numbers, it's going to multiply significantly. And so this is kind of a cool thing that you can also use. It gives you a little bit more description in terms of how to actually play with it, if you're not sure about some of the terms. But this is kind of one thing that you can kind of establish and look at to see actually how is it going to move the needle and why you should invest in like the post-sale experience. And then I also included kind of like a case study of what we built over, like I said, the 2 years I've been working at Freshworks, talking about some of the examples, some of the data points that I talked about, even just in this presentation, the hypothesis that we want to be able to prove out, and really some of the things that we were able to kind of do, and some of the kind of like the big outcomes that we were driving as a business across the organization. And then kind of in terms of like how we've architectured our business and the way that we think about our ecosystem, which is the Freshworks Collective, around kind of like 3 different tracks. And in any case, you can kind of take a look at this in more detail. And then the company intelligence place, if you wanted to put in a company like HubSpot, it may take a little bit of time just to pull the responses. But this will show you kind of, like I said, all the publicly facing information related to HubSpot in terms of their ecosystem. No surprise, I would say that HubSpot is pretty best in class when it comes to how they run community engagement programs, etc. But I think it's actually really awesome that they're sort of like one of the gold standards. And you can see some of the examples. Again, some of this may be inaccurate, but this is based on kind of what we're able to pull based on public information, and kind of some things there. And then there's a glossary of terms in terms of just, if you're not sure what some of the things mean, you can understand a little bit more what an advocate score is, what a CLG pillar is in more detail, like key programs, etc. And the last thing that I think is actually pretty cool is you can ask Kevin. So I built a co-pilot of sorts. So I took 5+ years of my own knowledge and information from presentations, content, etc. I distilled it into, originally I built this in ChatGPT, but now I kind of translate it over to Claude. So you can ask any of these questions as sort of like these are initial prompts, and it will give you responses. You can ask it pretty much anything. And this is kind of a cool thing that you can just ask it in case you have any additional questions that have come up from this whole diagnostic experience, and more details from there. So in closing, I just kind of want to showcase that to you guys. I know we're running out of time, so I will transition to last slide. If you have any questions, this again is my Substack, and I'm here to answer any other questions you guys might have in the remaining couple minutes we do have on this session.
Yes. Thank you, Kevin. It was amazing. We are on time, so maybe it's a good idea for you to pick one question, at least for us to answer. How do you feel about this? There are 3 questions.
So the first question, if someone wants to reposition their community internally as a growth lever, where should they start? What language or framing actually works? It's a really good question. I think what I had to translate to my own CEO and C-suite at the time when I had to build this at Freshworks is that if you look at any major franchise, whether it's a sports franchise, you look at some of the best-in-class tech organizations like the Salesforce of the world, you need to build sort of a fan base of customers that understand, that value, what they, your product, your solutions, right? Like it has to be beyond just sort of like the intrinsic value of what your solution does. And it has to go beyond sort of like the sales cycle. So how do you create that broader sense of, impact around sort of like an ecosystem you're building? It's sort of like this ecosystem play. You've heard of sort of like partner ecosystems. You've heard of technology ecosystems. I do think a community is an ecosystem or a microcosm. And I think that's the same way that gets translation into the C-suite, because a lot of executives understand partner ecosystems in a large way. The same thing applies, I think, to community in terms of you might have partners that are in your community. They might be helping offering services. They might be helping to triage and answer questions. I mean, that's how it was at Adobe. And so translating that for your C-suite in terms of the outcome that's going to drive around the focus on building an ecosystem where you can tap it into, ask them questions or voice the customer feedback. It largely will probably help also drive expansion. I think that's kind of the other key thing.
That's nice. So we have some time, a few minutes. Let's go for the second one. So community is often misunderstood at the leadership level. What are people getting wrong most often?
Yeah, I mean, I want to reframe it a little bit. It's not necessarily getting wrong. I don't think it's anything that we are doing as a disservice to ourselves necessarily. I think it's really about just how do we translate, and that's why I like using the word decoder ring, because whether you grew up with like cereal boxes and you had mail-in giveaways and like decoder rings were part of sort of like that thing that you grew up as a kid, it's just like how do you translate that business jargon a little bit differently so that it perks the interests of your C-suite in a different way. So a lot of it is because a C-suite leader, they may think of community as like an online forum. Like, I mean, they think of it as a destination that someone can type in like community.freshworks.com. That's a place to go to. But if they spend, and I think you guys all know this, as people spend like, even just like 20 minutes looking through a community forum, there's so much rich content and information. And I think the aspect is we have to be able to kind of translate all the other things that community does deliver, whether it's like the AEO piece, search, that is like top of mind for every executive team, because with SaaS apocalypse and all the things happening, especially if you're a public company, search and LLM it's like one of the top 5 things that every executive team is looking at. And how, if they're seeing diminishing returns on their website, we have to go back to kind of all the other pieces of what we built within our ecosystem to be able to help address those issues. And I think that's kind of the language that you can communicate easily to your leaders around the value of community, like full stop, as well, of course, like all the other goodwill things that we're driving, from advocacy, from the value exchange, addressing support issues, etc.
Yes. Last one, quickly. We've got 3 questions. We can answer them all. So James is asking, if someone wants to reposition their community internally as a growth lever, where should they start? What language or framing actually works?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's similar to the other 2 questions. The language is, again, like it's less about like community membership, less about sort of, like we're seeing engagement, which is great, but really it's around like how's this going to be like a force multiplier, or focusing on sort of like that ecosystem play, because that is where it creates like that 2 + 2 = 16 equation. That's what we need to be able to kind of translate for our executive team. Yes, all those kind of good things around, building out sort of like that goodwill within your employee or within your customer base is great. That's all positive things. But I think the other aspects around, it's helping with support deflection, it's helping with expansion growth, it's helping with building out this broader sense of ecosystem that's supporting the post-sale experience. It's making it sticky. Those are all things that translate really well, especially for a CFO, a CEO, that's very much focused on net dollar retention. Like, this is the thing that kind of drives me crazy as a practitioner myself, is that most companies make 75% of their revenue from the post-sale, whether it's through renewals, expansion motion, but most of those teams get a fraction of the actual investment compared to like new business. And that's always been the case in every company I've ever worked at. But I think the challenge is because we have a difficult time kind of translating that to these leaders. Like it becomes more of a broader conversation around what's the value of community in consideration with customer success, support, all those other post-sale levers. So that's kind of like how you can drive more shared outcomes and goals, essentially.
Yes. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful for everyone. But if you guys have questions, I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, so feel free to just connect with me or ask me a question separately.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing all of this with us. So, as you guys know, 5 minutes break. We will be back soon.